We are very pleased that to have Ian Walker here today. He's the Executive Director of the New Democracy Foundation, and most of the participatory budgeting and the participatory democracy trials and pilots and activities around Australia in the last couple of years have been done under the umbrella or the guidance of the New Democracy Foundation. So when there's hard decisions to be taken in communities, to share hard decisions with communities by local government, the New Democracy Foundation has a lot of capacity and expertise to come up with the methodologies that work. They sort of believe that we do need a better system, and as I said, the foundation has been involved in a lot of trials and activities on the ground that have been very successful. So to explain the philosophy and the practice and the future directions, could you please welcome Ian Walker?
That's excellently tough to follow. Thank you, Councillor Mayne. In the time we have today, I want to spend about half the time just stepping through who we are and what are the why and how you should do something differently. I'm going to try and use City of Melbourne as an example because it's one of those rare examples where if you think I'm bluffing, you can ask them. Within that, then I want to leave about half the time open just to questions as well, because as we saw then, there's a lot of curiosity as to how on earth does this actually work in practice? And I almost wanted to answer every question that came up out of that last grouping. The starting point for why do something differently actually came out of there's a question from Onka Paringa, and I couldn't quite see where that came from. I'm elected, I can take the decision. Now, most of my conversations in local government start with what's hard. And an example recently, someone said, we're meant to be redoing community pools and we've been kicking it down the road for 10 years because there's a small group of people. And straight away, that's the point where you say, stop. You can take the decision, but in practical terms, you're constrained. Your hands are tied because of the highly adversarial nature of almost every discussion that you have with your community. Because when we start to look at that bell curve of who you're going to hear from, you hear from two ends, you hear from two tails on that curve. You as council, you as the government absolutely have to do this. You also hear from, if you do what they want, it's the end of the world. Here. That's our starting point. I want you to think when you think about the future of local government, what's the hard part? And perhaps, is the time around an election the most efficient time that you have? Now, we suggest, and lose some friends doing it, that the election process, elections are an impediment to democracy. Because democracy is not the vote. Democracy is an expression of the general will and your ability to act on it. We design processes that help to elicit the general will, and in so doing, because they've got everyday people standing there, actually give you the capacity to act. But each time you need to go to an election, that gets eroded a little bit. When you actually go back, this is actually the Athenian ideal of democracy. So that is the grounding where we come from. I just want to use that as a jumping off point because that Onka Paringa example of why should I even consider doing this, the starting point for why care for the next 40 minutes is there are some things where you are so heavily constrained. I should start a little bit with who we are. So New Democracy is a not-for-profit research foundation. We're a charity. We are substantially funded by one person who used to be a political donor, Luca Belgiano-Nettis. His father started Transfield. You can probably pick how this goes. From the time he could walk, he got hit up for political donations. In 2005, he was at a fundraising dinner and said, "This is rubbish. We all pretend we give money out of civic contribution and we don't. We all want to know when we can pick up the phone. So I'll tell you what, I'll write you one more cheque and you put review of funding on the agenda. That's my price to play." And the politician concerned, who's still around, so we don't name them, said, "I think you'll write your cheque anyway if you want to keep working in this state." It's just the wrong thing to say to the wrong person. Luca contacted the University of Sydney and said, "What can I do to take money out of democracy? What can I do to restore trust in the decisions that we take? I really think funding reform is the starting point." And wonderfully, he had called the School of Government and not the Vice-Chancellor's office, who was hitting him up for a library. And the School of Government said, "You are completely wrong. Read these 5 books, come back when you know something." And the books were on deliberative democracy. The books were on the use of the jury system in the Athenian model. And Luca, best way you could have treated him, said, "These are fantastic. where is this being done? And universities do not spend their time going to councils and ministers' office. And it was more an orientation towards the theoretical. So the foundation was created as a bridge. There are some great ideas in academia. There are some very difficult problems facing mayors, ministers, premiers. We act as that bridge. Our conversation with the City of Melbourne started because they had a hard problem where, in our view, the political process would provide a barrier. When you look at how the gap, a contested gap, absolutely, but let's shorthand it, 900 million, $1 billion, is because the natural process of democracy is one of a wish list. I will provide you an upgrade to Queen Victoria markets. I will provide you an urban forest. That's great. People very rarely say the price tag that comes with that. So we, as a research foundation, are aiming to say, how are you going to have this trusted arbiter to innovate in democracy? So we're backed by a couple of former premiers from each side of politics. People from both the non-government sector and the social side through to Jennifer Westacott at the BCA. By definition, in the nicest possible way, we don't have any policy position, so when it comes to the City of Melbourne, we don't care what you do. I don't care if you halve your services or triple your rates. We simply have no view. But we think we can operate a methodology where you can get that informed community view to come to the fore. What makes this work? There's really 5 points that you need to land on. These are simple principles. Issues, populations, things change, but we build around 5 principles. And this is where one of these principles especially can be really hard for councils to say, you really want me to do that? But once we can step through that, that's where we find these projects work. And that's why Councillor Mayne talks about a workshop where probably, it's a slightly tough outing on occasions, but this is how we introduce the concept. Of the 5 elements, random selection. We trust juries to lock people up for 25 years. If council changes the amount of money collected out of the parking meters, there will be a furore, there will be a controversy. You're anti-car, you're taxing people, you're doing this. Compare those 2 items. What changed? These people have to run for office, so they're easy to throw rocks at. The jury passes a people like me test. While I noticed, absolutely we pulled people of skill. There were lawyers, architects, but what we get is a distribution from the community. There was dentists, homeopaths, childcare workers, someone who was unemployed, people with a disability. We get a real random mix across the community. So yes, we have a mild skew to the more educated, but the emphasis is because we follow the census profile for the area, you're going to get this element where people of all ages and backgrounds and work experience can look at this group and say, hey, that's people like me making a decision, whereas many of our representative houses can look like places where there are 54 to 65-year-old males in suits, and it just, a lot of the community does struggle with that. I was delicate. The second point, I'm rapidly approaching, thank you. The second key variable, time. I cannot overstate how important this is. For a deliberative process to work, we pose people a question, we give them bricks of information and let them unpick it. If you rush it, it fails. It's absolutely binary. As issues vary in terms of complexity, planning issues take an immense amount of time. A budgetary issue we've started to land on is very consistently a 50-hour exercise. And you need to spread the meetings out because people need to go away from a meeting, come back and have read it, and it doesn't rely on every person reading every piece of information. It relies on that intervening 3 weeks between meeting 1 and meeting 2, someone saying, have you seen on page 32 there's a thing about what they spend on service area A? And all the other people turn to it. And the more people digest it, it's this many eyes looking at a problem. We did a process for Premier Weather on alcohol reform in South Australia where someone found out in the Licensing Act that it was not legal to serve food and play music in a venue. When this eventually went through, they said, well, this is a barrier to the responsible service of alcohol and the nightlife we'd like to have. The Attorney General, when he finally looked at the recommendations, just said, who knew that was there? It had been sat on the books for 30 years. A lobbyist had managed to push it through because large non-food serving venues thought it was awesome to protect that out. And this is the benefit you get from those fresh eyes. It comes from time. The third key piece we wanted to point to is this notion of information neutrality. When we talk about what will council be sharing, what will any government agency be sharing? The starting point is if it can be FOI'd, you're sharing it. You may as well push it out now. When it came to expressing the budget, the City of Melbourne is a large and complex beast, circa 400 million a year coming in and out. We said we can't show people an annual report. It's not intelligible the way they understand it. I want you to express your budget in $1 to $5 million chunks of money. We're going to go through and we're going to re-express that, not in capital works, just tell them in pavements and roads what it is and what you get for it. Not in aggregated services to the community, but split that money out. That is an enormously time-consuming exercise. So when it comes to what commitment does council have to make, yes, there's the commitment of people, particularly in the financial team, to actually generate that information and for it to pass a plain English test was a starting point. That companions with two other mandatory elements of what we do. The first is our starting point is we say to the community who are very conditioned to, you can find an expert to say anything. I'd like to build a road outside. You can probably find someone who says that road will endanger a habitat. You will probably find someone who says it will be fantastic for economic development. You can probably hire a range of consultants on that basis. So we invert that. What do you need to know and who do you trust to inform you? It wasn't that they said they needed a demographer and we found them Bernard Salt. It was when we said we need a demographer, we said from a university, from a consultancy, and they discussed and said, we like Bernard Salt, we trust him. We trust him is the key source in getting information that works for this process. And so it was, we've seen this in a variety of processes around the place. We did an energy inquiry, actually at the peak of the carbon tax discussion for the New South Wales Parliament. And the group of citizens said, working out who they trust, we've heard a solar farm had failed to find investment in Western New South Wales. We want the lead investor behind that, and we want the most senior person we can get from AGL who wouldn't buy the 30 years of output. You can see they calculated who their own sources were, which was quite different from who would have contributed to a government inquiry. Again, you can see what this takes, time. It takes us time to source these people. And that's where setting these meetings at 3 weeks gaps and being able to say to council, we need at least 5 months to operate. We can do it, but this is the amount of time it's going to take us to do it. By doing that, you get substance. Now, I'm not going to dob on the council concerned. We have been approached by someone who said we have this enormous budgetary problem. We'd like to solve it. We like the jury process. Looks a bit expensive. We want to do this in 2 weeks. From a fair starting point, obviously I've warmed you up a little bit today, but from a fair starting point for a lot of consultation processes, if you took people through two all-day Saturdays, that's not a bad amount of time. And we said to them, it'll break. It'll break. You can guess what happened. A group of people came together and once they worked out the size of the problem, they said, you can only have brought us together if you've already worked out the solution. You're trying to get us to stand in front of a bus that you don't want to stand in front of. It's absolutely accurate would be my assessment. People are smart if you give them time and give them credit, and that's what happened. When they tried to have the press come in for that, and Stephen Mayne's shown you some good press, 11 people stood with their back to the camera. If you try to force it, it will break. There are no silver bullets. It's like many things in life, you can do it well or you can do it badly. So I just wanted to emphasise that element there between time and information. They are your strongest companion points. Fourth point, authority. When we first started doing this, it was actually the Mayor at Canada Bay who laughed at me because I'd asked him what was hard and he said, are you new? What's hard? Here's my revenues. Here's my costs. That's what's hard. That's what's hard for everyone. Do I want to be the mayor who raises rates or the mayor who cuts services? What a fantastic choice that is. What do you want to do with that? And I said, well, how does community engagement work for you? And he put his head in his hands, just went, I see the same 7 people. And he gave me a short story that they'd done something on outdoor play equipment which had to be renewed. Literally 2 people turned up. One of them was getting out of the rain, just came in and went, you got biscuits, this all looks wonderful. What happened? They took the decision they thought was right. Do you do a little bit of play equipment in 140 parks, or do you do your giant plastic McDonald's fun park, rubberised floor in 20 parks? What happened? Everyone, the conspiracy theorists came straight out with, you must have a connection to the play equipment company. The super parks are close to your house. I think Angelo's kids are 20 and 22. I think it's a nice touch for why you build slippery dips there. You started to go through, there's a fake mayor's Twitter account that still has 320 followers. You can't get a trusted decision. So when I said to him, I'm going to get a jury of 35 people I pick at random, he laughed at me. He said, you will not get 35 regular people to come out and care about council business for 5 Saturdays. And I still note a little bit of shock from councillors at each time these people turn up on a sunny Saturday and say, they're all still here. So we, as a research foundation, looked at why do people accept these invitations. 3 things stood out. It was random, so I figured it came to another normal person like me and not the kind of person who goes to council meetings. Secondly, you put the authority in bold on the invitation, so I knew what would happen to my decision. I normally don't bother commenting on government things because it goes into the black hole and it's not worth my time. And the third part was, it was finite. It may seem amazing that we can ask for this amount of time from citizens, but it has a beginning and an end. Now, most things, if you contribute in society, your kids' team, whatever it may be, it's kind of open-ended. What are you getting out from it? We put dates and times on there, and while it's immense, you can plan your time around it, so it is achievable. And the final point I wanted to land out of these mandatories of random selection, time, information, authority, the final point I wanted to land on is this idea of the blank sheet of paper. How does government frequently consult? I'll pick on Transport for New South Wales because they're the worst offender. And I'm in Victoria. Here is our draft transport plan. Invite comment. Here is our final release. We now have a Where's Wally exercise of trying to find the difference between the two, except for the cover sheet that says we conducted 32 sessions, had 1,040 comments and 15 people. Did we change anything? No, we did not. So invert that. We don't let draft solutions go to juries. What's the problem? We write the problem and a blank sheet of paper, and then we sit through council workshops to explain you're about to go into an uncontrolled situation. Where this lands is where it lands. We have had government agencies suggest if this doesn't go down a certain path halfway through, then we won't pay you. And I'm backed by a billionaire and a couple of former premiers. Watch me care. We can ride a little bit of heat. We're not a consultancy. We don't look for repeat business. It's just we're going to take this where it goes. But if you have a problem that is fairly hard, if you have a significant potential funding gap across 10 years, and you open all possible solutions, you'll get some things that dramatically widen the agenda of opportunities for you. What was hard, as Councillor Maynes acknowledged, he got some answers he didn't really like in the results. Probably also some answers where you say, well, at least now we have a snapshot, not of an opinion poll, how people thought after 10 seconds in the street, after 50 hours of asking to speakers of their own choosing, after pulling apart the numbers of, pulling the finance people back more time than they can count to interrogate figures, they found how they would address that problem. I did want to, with Marrickville, I was councillor, I did notice that, we have noticed a mild skew, that citizens do tend to solve the problem all in one swathe. They don't kick a lot of the problem down the road, so they will tend to not use debt as an exercise of we can borrow this. They will tend to always find a way to pay for it. We're trying to work out if that's a long-term skew, but it's absolutely an observable pattern, and that people will go for things that are not immediately apparent. Almost every councillor we first talk to thinks that citizens will come back and want more services and lower rates. And most things we do, they do absolutely cut into levels of service. And overwhelmingly, when they've looked at it, they are happy to pay a little more. And that's just a general trend that we understand there's an electoral pressure to keep rates down. A group of people who are not under electoral pressure have tended to be willing to pay more in certain areas. And the appetite for fines and parking meters has also proved consistent somehow as well. Even from Canada Bay, they came back and said, so we're paying to maintain all these roads. People drive from outside the area, park for 9 hours, hit them. It was that blunt. Normally a council putting in parking meters would be the end of time. 34 people were unanimous in saying, well, you've got to pay for the roads. What an absolutely logical way to pay for the road you're resurfacing. I don't have a view, I don't care how often people maintain roads. whether it looks like the third runway or a dirt track. But it's interesting if you can actually find that common ground among people. I want to start to open up to questions, and I want to close with the rebaking opportunity that Councillor Mayne offered me. We are doing these as one-off projects as proofs of concept. I have a huge amount of self-interest at work, and my self-interest is that I want to show that if I pick everyday people in random juries, they solve problems really well. And we think they have a complementary role to play alongside elected officials. If you want to rebuild or rebake and reuse a jury, why not constitute them as effectively an upper house? We have had discussions. There's a council that we're working with who said, you know what would be great? An automatic trigger for certain decisions where we go into a new service area, increase spending by more than $1 million, or change planning rules. That's an automatic trigger that the council decision also gets passed to a random group, and that random group we retain for a year. A year is the absolute outer limit we're ever going to keep a group of people together, because we're not trying to institutionalise people. We're trying to keep people with day jobs and to pull them in and out as we need be and not make the time commitment. So I'll give you a year. I'll give it on a group that we recruit, not on a single issue basis and then flip them into something else. But that is an element where we'd say there is absolutely this companion role that can exist. So when I look at the future of local government and why to change things and how to do it, for me, the future of local government has a complementary role, an established and embedded complementary role for a jury of citizens we pick at random. By picking people at random, you're going to hear from your community, not just those who try to act in their name by being the loudest voices at the table. So thank you for your engagement so far. I hope I've prompted the odd question.
Thank you very much, Ian. Teresa Dominic, Manningham City Council. And I really wanted to ask this question to Stephen, but you had too many other people wanting to ask questions. But it was actually quite appropriate that you actually took the statistic of the women presenting at this conference going from 28% to 22%. And my experience with panels is, yes, you do get 50% females on them. Certainly if we reflect back on the previous speakers and we're talking about the values in society, cultural changes, my experience is there are a lot of women driving that. When we look at, and I think Stephen has done a lot of work for women on boards. So if we look at board members of IT companies, we look at the gender balance in IT industry and even in local government. Your reflection on you get that balance, it comes in. I know 19% of senior positions in local government are women. I don't know the percentage for elective officials, but I think it's fairly similar. How do you have that disjunction when you do all of this work and then it comes into a system that doesn't have that balance?
So firstly, we do technically a stratified random selection, which is to match to census profile, which once you get to a population of any size is falling somewhere around 50-50. So we know in our juries we've always recruited very easily around that. It's stratified so that if 10% of the population is 25 to 34, that we put 10% of that age group in the room. You can probably imagine what our natural response rates are when you first do the random set of invitations. Who responds the most? Male 55 to 64 here, male 18 to 24 here, and then we just match the population by doing another cut across that curve. We've seen no disjunction when it goes to a group of councillors, in as much as they've given you such a hard problem. They're not looking at it through those lenses. They're looking for a solution, and it's never really arisen as a point of specific interest that we start to see differences in sets of values. One of the key things that we do is try to really create two-way exposure between councillors and the jury for two reasons. Firstly, you want the councillors to look at this group of people and say, hey, this is a reasonable group of people. And from the jury side, they absolutely feel taken more seriously. The more they see the councillors in front of them, we're really being heard, this is important. So the councillors who give of their time, and yes, get to make their case, have a really good experience of that, and it really contributes. And I think that familiarisation process of getting to know each other throughout what is a multi-month process kind of helps with the socialisation. When the decision comes, at least it's not coming as a report from an advocacy group, it's coming from people they know.
Hi, good morning. Anthony Richards from Department of Internal Affairs in New Zealand. What proportion of people say yes when invited to be on the juries?
Okay, so this is a band. We can, on almost anything, we can rely on 5% is a very natural rate. As a floor, we're averaging between 10 and 11% response rate. Now, this is to an unnamed random piece of direct mail, essentially. So those of you who have done this more generally know that fragments of a percent are common. When we talk to councils, we give a piece of advice, which is make it look like a royal wedding invitation. This thing needs to stand out as it comes through. Silver embossed, Premier's office, we throw in as much weight as we can behind it as well, and it surges up the response rates. We did around 10% in Marrickville, a little lower in Melbourne. We really struggle with just one or two demographics, and this is the youngest council area in Australia by average age. So 18 to 24s make my life miserable. It's really, really difficult to say, here's the 50 hours you need to turn up for, and you get phone calls going, oh, might come along for an hour on the second day. Like, read it. Serenity. So yeah, the response rates, our peak response rate's 38%. Our lowest, and we were doing it thinking, wow, if anyone was ever going to not respond to an invitation, this is the one. We just did a project for the Minister for the Environment in South Australia. It was on a drainage network. This is going to random people. It spanned a geographic area of roughly 350 kilometres by 120 kilometres, so people were going to have to stay all weekend. It was in the middle of bushfire season for people working on farms. We just look at this going, if we can recruit on this, we can get over in a hurdle. We got 2.7%. We were forecasting 2 because of all the impairments. Your impact more turns to be on the mixed nature. You just got more people who already knew about the issue. The vast majority of the time, I can say my number one promise to jurors is, to councillors, walk in the room, tell me how many people you know. You'll get one. I think City of Melbourne there were 2 or 3 because we skewed to business ratepayers as well. Canada Bay was nil. I think Marrickville was 2, where the councillors came in and said, I know person A. So that's the kind of mix you get. We think that's the rate at which they exist in the community, that people with an active interest engaging occur. So that's the response rates we can rely on. Topic under 10 words matters a great deal. Make it worth my time.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. I don't know. Oh, sorry.
Greg Box, Sierra Rangers Council. And this might be a relevant question given what you were just talking about. What role of new and social media in this innovative space? So you've talked a lot, and I know the emphasis on in the room, because I've heard you say that a few times. So I suppose the interesting thing is about what the possibilities are within that space.
So, 2-part answer. We are not direct democracy advocates. We think people who just go on and click to say yes is a disaster waiting to happen. I did a talk at State Parliament with the member for Sydney, who used to head Australian marriage equality, and it was around direct democracy. And I think that it was set up that he would say direct democracy is awesome, and I would predictably say it's not. And he made the point of, it's not a topic where we want campaigned outcomes. Yeah, I could probably get 300,000 people to log in online and say it's awesome, but if Hillsong get 301,000 people to say, no, it's a terrible idea, do I give up? So we tend to look at, does this add to a trusted public decision? The best way to think of online tools in that environment for us is agenda setting and not decision making. I'd like council to be discussing pools is better than saying, council have got to build us a pool. And that separation is something we try to embed. When we do a process design for someone like the city, use the tools at the top of a funnel, and you're going to get a wish list of more things than you can afford to do. So use the jury as the trade-off, and it's that switch from wish list to trade-off. So that would be my starting point. By all means, get people engaged in it, but be aware of that limitation, and so please don't go in with an expectation that you'll get, wow, 1,000 people want this, therefore it's our decision-making method. The example we've given is, if you were to go online, and you could come back and say, we need a figure skating arena. I would suggest that's more an indication that you have half dozen very well organised figure skaters than there is latent demand amongst your 100,000 residents for it. If you were to take that same proposal and put it in front of 40 people we pick at random, and after 50 hours they come out and say, on balance, we're willing to pay for that. That's going to be great for the community. It'll have an impact, employment. It's going to be X dollars on my rates and I can live with it. We think that's the substantive part that should inform you for that decision.
Oh, sorry. Juanita Wilson, Tamworth Regional Council. I'm interested to know if the panel is able to share the progress they're making with the media and the community during the process, and is the community and are the media interested in the process, or has it emerged once they've reached the end of that process?
Thank you. I love questions that help me out for bits of content that I've missed. It's absolutely imperative you show the community who these people are before a decision is reached. If you see this group of people and you go, hey, that's people like me, that looks pretty reasonable, this is a better way of making decisions, when they ultimately report, you're more likely to live with what they've said. If the wider community hears of these people is, we're not selling citywide and we're raising rates and we're getting rid of buildings, I don't like the decision, therefore I don't like the people. So we have a metric that we push of, I need to get photos of the participants up at least 4 or 5 times throughout the process. You have to get those photos up before a decision is reached. It's tricky because the media kind of looks at it and says, so what's the controversial part? And of course we're trying to tart it up and say, look how high risk it is, what council have entered into, but they're still trying to look for where's the conflict? And there isn't really conflict in it. It requires, we try to spend a lot of time with editors at media outlets saying, everyone complains about democracy. Well, this is an attempt at a solution. Do you want to follow it or not? And yes, I think you've taken my best line. In terms of our discussions with most editors, the most colourful of which was Paul Whittaker at the Daily Telegraph, who didn't start out loving what we do, said, most media outlets' main contention is you, dear reader, would make a wise and enlightened decision, look at what these clowns over here are doing. Well, I'm doing that. If I pick 100 people, how many Daily Telegraph readers am I hitting? How many Age readers am I hitting? It's just sampling. I'm going to hit them in proportion and your readers are going to get that chance. Are you telling me your readers are too stupid to make this decision? And so that element, the media they have given us a pretty good run, but it's absolutely a critical element.
Andrew McHugh, South Gippsland Shire. I'm really interested about the overall impact of this on the credibility of local government and its brand image. What we've got in Australia and globally is, I think as Alan talked about, is the fragmentation of belief in politics. Loyalty and trust are fundamental to good governance, but they're increasingly being withdrawn from governments and being withdrawn from local government in particular. Our council, in its normal budgetary process, did a section, is it 232 or 23, whatever number it is, the previous year, and we got 30 people, or 0.3% of the population. This year we used an Our Say platform with an open piece of paper saying, what would you want us to do? And we had 765% or 3% of the population. It shifted the whole dynamics. It shifted the representative model of, in effect, a closed club that once elected makes decisions behind closed doors, into one where they actually had to engage and consult and relate to the community. It's dramatic. What I would like to know, because what you're talking about is slightly different from this is your first part of filtering ideas, if you like, that we did.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I would like to know is, are you doing work on evaluating what impact that the process has had both on the individuals and on the perception? Because brand identity is about the quality of experiences and relationships people have with an organisation or an entity. This, for the individuals involved, directly changes that, but to what extent is that shared across the community, and to what extent is this a way forward to rebrand local government as a genuine level of participatory democracy?
I think it's absolutely an opportunity. I have a multi-part answer for you, so see if I can follow through. We've researched what happens to people when they finish a process like this. We see it immediately that there's a very quick, gee, this is much harder than it looks. And that in itself, even if we've had things which absolutely endorsed an existing status quo for the agency concerned, and at first they were a little bit disappointed, the City of Sydney on their alcohol policy, and then they realised, wow, how often do you actually get people to look at something in detail and say, we essentially like it. We started out not liking it, it's really hard, we can live with this, here's some tweaks that you want. Second thing that emerges, we only discovered it by accident, 30 to 40% of people end up volunteering in their community. They decide they like mixing with a new group of people. They've decided they like getting out of the house, and we discovered it by accident afterwards. It started out as anecdotally people just getting in touch. I really enjoyed it, so I've done X, and we've started to follow that as a trend all the way through. Impact in the community. The local government elections in 2012 in New South Wales, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit. There's two measures we look at for success. Yes, you can research things and extract stats of that you can find success in things. We have a really simplistic binary measure for impact. Does the decision get acted on? Does it turn into legislation? Well, did the decision change is really the one-line impact point. You can have lots of wonderful motherhood statements and cuddles, but did it change? Related to that, yes, Canada Bay was a process we did in 2011-2012. We hit an accidental statistic that we didn't know we'd be looking for. Most people will be familiar that in 2011, the state election that was held was the most dramatic two-party preferred result in any Western democracy. So it was pretty tough times for Labor councillors and mayors at that time. The mayor in Canada Bay was a Labor mayor, and I mentioned the discussion that we'd had. He did a process with us. The 2012 local government elections roll around, 152 local government areas in New South Wales. In how many did a Labor mayor increase his primary vote? 1. And he called me a few days afterwards and was, mate, I've had a pretty good electoral result. I won't pretend that people know what you guys do, but they see people standing in front of their own decisions and they like it. And that is the clearest summary of the jury. People don't need to get the technical nature of what we do, but they see the gaggle of young, old, mixed, from tradies to lawyers. They see the mix working together and say, that looks fair enough. Councillors on all sides of politics through that process were saying, we got a good run through the Daily Telegraph. And they said, we're going to the shops and people are tapping us on the paper, tapping us on the shoulder with the newspaper. People who normally hassle us are saying, yeah, finally getting some real people in there. We don't go with the anecdotal too much, but the electoral result does stand out. We haven't done a detailed explanation of causality. We didn't poll voters, but a 1 in 152 result, if it's a fluke, it's a fantastic one.
Ian, just a quick question about other stakeholders. People in municipalities like the City of Casey or Frankston, they're stakeholders in what happens in Melbourne, and if Melbourne makes decisions about parking, it has a significant impact on people who have to come in occasionally to the courts or whatever, and $80 a day, a lot of people just can't pay. And that seems to be the net effect of, well, potentially the effect of some of the decisions municipalities like Melbourne make. And you mentioned before that people tend to make not in my backyard type decisions through citizen panels. You said the stuff about the 9-hour parking. I mean, those people coming to park there for 9 hours a day, that might have been their only option to get there, etc. You weren't getting the voice of those from outside the municipality.
Okay, so it's a fair point. When we did the alcohol process for City of Sydney, the first definitional point we go to is who is the community? In that instance, we chose to split into 3 groups, 3 14s, excuse me. And in those 3 groups, we looked at people who live in the city, people who work in the city, people who use the city for entertainment. So when we sent out invitations, we just use Australia Post. They have a database of every address they've delivered mail to. We took swathes across a 100-kilometre radius, essentially, and dropped them into those 3 groups. So that's how we look at those affected communities. You can't be perfectly exhaustive. So one of the other companion techniques we've done, which we did for the environment process in South Australia, we had a great criticism once where someone said, I get your point with the jury, but your information process, which asks them who they trust, can be a bit hit and miss. How do I know they're going to hit someone where if you haven't spoken to person X, I don't think they've been properly informed? So for the environment process, we took 90 incredibly aggrieved stakeholders. It was a pitchfork and burning tar meeting. They don't like the minister. They don't like him one little bit. We kept the 4-letter words to a rough minimum. And we said to them, that's great. I've opened up this process. you get to pick the first 5 speakers this jury hears from. Discuss who it is. There was a mix of views, but it got to the point where this is uncontrolled. They left the meeting saying, this is all very pretty. You'll never be able to get this through the minister so that those speakers actually appear. We sign off all that way up front. So the proof to those people was they saw those first 5 speakers on the first weekend and there was this, it really is uncontrolled. This uncontrolled element I can't say enough because it's the part that makes it work. Once you start, you've pushed a snowball down the hill and it goes where it goes.
Ian, you touched on my question in that last response, but I'm very interested in how you actually build that invitation list.
Oh, sure. Different databases exist. Single council areas are obviously comparatively simple because we can just pull addresses from a land title system quite simply. Where we need to span out beyond the area, Australia Post has a fantastic database. In certain states, we can work with the Electoral Commission, except New South Wales, where we were ruled not in the public interest. Not that I'm bitter. So we start to vary by that. We've talked to Telstra about billing inserts because they can reach millions of people. They're relatively easy to get. Once you realise you don't need a named database, you only need a physical address. Physical address, we look at community and it's not the electoral roll. Under 18s are simply, 18 to 24s are simply not enrolling to vote. So the penetration on the electoral roll is about 45%. Well, no, I want to reach broader groups than that. Because we do this 2-round selection, we do oversample at the front end for younger databases. So in South Australia, here in the City of Melbourne, we also got university student databases. You got 50,000 students. I want you to randomly sample me 2,000 names and we push addresses out to them. And it's because we know the response rates out of youth will be so low that we do need to put more in the front end. Those who express an interest and have time available, we're then just going to sample them at their rate in the population. So complementary databases help. But for a single council area, your land titles database is overwhelmingly a great place to start. It's simple and it's cheap.
Okay, can we please thank Ian Walker?
Pleasure. Thanks for that.